In the early winter of 1893, 18-year-old Henry Lawson set out to build a small lean-to on the steep northern cliff overlooking the settlement. The first flurries of snow clung stubbornly to the edges of roofs and fences, carried by the sharp wind that had begun to sweep down from the mountains. Villagers gathered at a distance, murmuring doubts at the boy's undertaking. They considered the location strange and dangerous, noting the sheer drop beneath the cliff and the exposure to winter's full force. Samuel, the town blacksmith, leaned on a fence post, his hands resting on the weathered wood, remarking that such a project could only end in collapse. Charles, a farmer from the edge of the settlement, shook his head quietly, warning that heavy snow might bury the structure before it was even completed. If you'd like to follow more historical accounts of survival, you can like, share, and subscribe. Which part of Henry's preparation do you think made the greatest difference? The insulation, the anchoring, or his choice of location? Henry moved with deliberate care, measuring each timber, sketching placements, and fitting beams together with steady hands. He worked alone for the most part, though his dog Brindle followed him along the narrow cliff path, stepping carefully over rocks and frozen soil. The boy's focus was methodical. He checked every joint and support, aware that a single misstep could prove fatal. A few onlookers murmured among themselves, debating whether the lean-to would survive even a mild winter. Yet Henry did not respond. The air was cold, carrying the scent of ice and pine, and the valley below was quiet except for the distant rush of a small stream that had begun to freeze along its banks. Henry positioned the lean-to in a shallow alcove of the cliff, allowing the rock to act as partial shelter against wind and snowfall. He arranged the wooden planks to overlap, ensuring water runoff would not seep into the interior, and layered moss between beams where gaps appeared. Each task was slow and meticulous, the kind of labor that demanded patience more than speed. By late afternoon, the first thin layer of snow dusted the cliff, and Henry paused to examine his work, noting the slight flecks of the beams and the way the overhang deflected the light flurries. He adjusted a brace, tightened a cord, and watched the valley below, mindful that the storm of winter was only beginning. Despite the murmurs of doubt, Henry continued without comment, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. The lean-to, perched high above the village, appeared fragile from below, yet every calculated adjustment strengthened its resilience. The villagers slowly drifted away as daylight faded, leaving the boy alone with Brindle and the shadowed cliff face, the first snow settling silently around them. Henry's work continued into the early evening, guided by necessity and a quiet understanding of the elements, each measured motion a preparation for the harsher conditions that lay ahead. Neighbors began to gather at the base of the cliff, drawn by curiosity and concern as Henry lifted timber and secured the beginnings of his lean-to. The wind carried their murmurs across the frozen valley, a mixture of worry, derision, and speculation about the structure's fate. Samuel, the town blacksmith, rested against a fence post, nodding toward the precarious position, and remarked that such a project was reckless, certain to fail under winter's weight. Charles, a farmer who had come to check on his own livestock, shook his head slowly, noting that snow could bury the structure overnight and that Henry's efforts might be for naught. Even Robert, Henry's cousin, paused to watch the labor, questioning whether building so high above the valley was wise. The villagers' voices carried faintly, overlapping as some offered advice, others simply speculated on the outcome. Yet Henry remained unmoved, continuing his work with deliberate focus. He adjusted the beams, checked lashings, and tested the supports, moving with precision that only patience and experience could achieve at his age. Brindle stayed close, alert to any movement below, but otherwise calm. Henry's eyes measured every angle of the cliff, assessing snowdrift and wind exposure, while the sound of distant wood splitting and hammer strikes mingled with the low murmur of observers. Some of the more cautious onlookers suggested he might delay until spring, noting the fragility of young timber under ice and snow. Henry did not respond. He only tightened a brace and adjusted a cord, ensuring the framework would hold. Even as the cold seeped into his hands and the wind cut across his face, the boy moved methodically, leaving no gesture to chance. By mid-afternoon, the villagers had begun to drift back toward their homes, still skeptical but aware that Henry's work continued unbroken. The lean-to, despite appearing fragile from below, took shape with careful, patient measures that none of the observers fully appreciated in the moment. Henry worked with deliberate care, securing each beam with rawhide cords that he twisted tightly to hold the wooden frame in place. He layered moss between the boards where gaps appeared, creating a rudimentary insulation that would slow the cold drafts sweeping up from the valley below. Scraps of canvas, gathered from previous work and unused cloth, were folded and pressed into corners to reinforce weak points, ensuring the lean-to could bear both snow and wind without sagging. His movements were methodical, each action measured, tested, and repeated until it met his standard for stability. Brindle followed closely along the narrow cliff paths, stepping carefully over frozen soil and jutting stones. The dog remained alert, ears twitching at the faintest sound from below, but he did not interfere with Henry's labor, walking only where the boy allowed. Occasionally, Henry would glance at the dog, giving a short command to keep him steady before returning to the task at hand. The repetition of hammering, measuring, and adjusting continued through the morning, the rhythm of labor unbroken by the biting wind. Villagers passed at a distance, their skepticism unchanged. Some paused to comment, suggesting Henry's efforts might be wasted against the harsh winter that had already begun to settle across the valley. Others merely observed in silence, noting the fragility of timber against ice and snow, yet unaware that each careful adjustment Henry made increased the lean-to's chance of surviving the season. The boy's hands were raw from handling rough wood and frozen ropes, and his breath formed clouds in the cold air, but he pressed on, focused on the precise positioning of each piece. By midday, the lean-to had taken recognizable shape, small but deliberate, a collection of beams and coverings that might have appeared insignificant to the untrained eye. Every piece was aligned to shed snow and resist gusts of wind, the overhang angled to protect the interior from the cliffside exposure. Henry paused briefly, scanning the valley and noting the way shadows stretched across the snow, then returned to check each lashing once more. Even as the sun fell behind distant ridges, he continued his work, aware that the coming days would put every precaution to the test. To keep exploring these stories of foresight and endurance, remember to like, share, and subscribe. How would you have reinforced a structure if faced with Henry's storm? By mid-December, the wind had sharpened noticeably, carrying fine particles of snow from the upper ridges and scattering them across the frozen slopes. Clouds gathered in thick, low formations, darkening the sky and signaling a storm that would soon sweep the valley. Temperatures fell steadily, and the villagers moved quickly, hurrying to secure livestock in barns and to stack firewood in preparation for the coming weather. Horses stamped impatiently in the stalls, and the faint creak of wooden beams accompanied the sounds of hurried activity. Henry observed the changes with careful attention. He noted the shifting patterns of wind against the cliff face and the way drifting snow accumulated in hollows along the slope. Adjusting the lean-to, he reinforced the overhang with additional lashings and tightened rawhide bindings where stress points might fail. Each adjustment was deliberate, aimed at ensuring the small structure could resist the pressure of heavy snowfall and gusting wind. Brindle remained close, alert but unbothered by the sudden intensification of the elements. The boy's work continued despite the chill that settled into his clothing and stiffened his movements. He checked the alignment of the roof, pressed moss into gaps, and made certain that every beam bore weight evenly. The lean-to, already modest in size, was shaped to withstand the snow's weight and to channel water safely away from the interior. Across the valley, small signs of winter appeared in every direction. Smoke from chimneys spiraled upward, branches sagged under frost, and the distant river began to ice over along its edges. Henry paused briefly to survey the cliff, measuring snow accumulation and listening to the low moan of the wind through the trees. Each subtle sound and visual cue guided his next movements. He returned to his work, making minor adjustments to ensure stability, knowing that the avalanche that threatened the valley would test both his foresight and every laborious measure taken to this point. Every motion was precise, patient, and methodical, marking preparation as the only reliable safeguard against the winter ahead. Before the storm fully struck, Henry paused atop the cliff, Brindle standing quietly at his side. The lean-to, now complete, rested against the mountainside, small and unobtrusive, its structure deliberate and orderly. Snow dusted the surrounding rocks, settling lightly on the moss and canvas of the shelter, hinting at the severity of the coming weather. Henry's hands, raw from labor, rested briefly on the rough timber as he surveyed the valley below, noting the patterns of wind and shifting clouds. The low murmur of the distant village carried faintly, mingling with the soft groan of the cliff under the cold. The boy's gaze swept the horizon, observing the shadows of trees and the frozen surface of the distant stream. Brindle shifted slightly but remained attentive, ears pricked. Henry adjusted a brace on the lean-to, ensuring its angle would deflect snow and ice, every measure accounted for. The stillness before the storm emphasized the isolation of the cliff and the meticulous preparation that had brought the shelter to this point. A sudden freeze gripped the mountain, turning the upper slopes to brittle ice, followed by heavy snowfall that accumulated rapidly across ridges and ledges. The valley below began to darken under the weight of the incoming storm, and a low rumble, almost imperceptible at first, hinted at the danger gathering above. Then, without warning, a massive avalanche broke free, surging down the mountainside with overwhelming force. Snow swept over fences, barns, and cabins, burying the weaker structures in a white tide that tore through the settlement. Henry remained in his lean-to, perched high on the cliff. The shelter, insulated with moss and anchored firmly with rawhide lashings, absorbed the first blows of wind-driven snow without faltering. The structure shivered under the impact, beams creaking under the shifting weight, yet every brace held firm. Brindle pressed close to Henry's side, ears flattened against the noise, yet untroubled by the lean-to's steadfastness. From below, the villagers watched in helpless awe as their homes disappeared beneath the rushing snow, powerless against the avalanche's force. The white wave circled the cliff's outcropping, the lean-to itself narrowly spared. Roofs collapsed, fences splintered, and livestock huddled in snowdrifts where shelter had failed. Henry moved carefully within the lean-to, checking each cord and beam to ensure stability while the storm continued its descent. The avalanche passed, leaving devastation in its wake, the valley transformed into a landscape of stark, frozen ruin. Only the small, precise structure that Henry had built with methodical care remained intact, proof of the measures taken and foresight applied long before the snow's arrival. For more quiet lessons from the frontier, like, share, and subscribe. What other precautions might have helped a cliffside shelter withstand an avalanche? At dawn, the village emerged cautiously, stepping over snowdrifts and debris to assess the aftermath. Paths were blocked by fallen fences and broken timber. Rooftops had collapsed under the weight of snow, and livestock wandered in scattered confusion, some trapped in drifts or partially buried. Smoke from a few chimneys rose weakly, mingling with the cold morning air, carrying the faint scent of wet wood and frozen soil. The damage was extensive, yet atop the northern cliff, the lean-to built by Henry Lawson remained unmarked, intact, and upright against the slope. Henry descended carefully, Brindle at his side, stepping along the narrow trail toward the settlement. He moved with deliberate caution, checking each foothold on the icy path while observing the village's state. Reaching the partially buried cabin of Joe, a young boy from the community, he worked to clear snow from around the entrance, lifting the boy free without hesitation. Joe shivered, but remained unharmed, his small hands grasping Henry's arm as they made their way to safer ground. Villagers watched silently, the early ridicule and doubt that had surrounded Henry's project giving way to quiet acknowledgement. Samuel, Charles, and Robert each approached at a distance, noting the precision of the lean-to and the thought that had gone into its construction. Henry offered no comment, only continued his measured work, checking the lean-to once more and scanning the cliff above for any remaining threats. The meticulous care and patient labor displayed over weeks had proven itself, transforming earlier skepticism into respect born of necessity and clear evidence. Even as the snow settled further, the village understood that foresight and methodical preparation had ensured survival where others had been undone. Over the following days, the village was transformed into a scene of organized labor. Villagers worked steadily to clear paths blocked by fallen timber and deep snow, moving slowly, but with deliberate care to avoid further accidents. Roofs that had collapsed under the avalanche were dismantled and rebuilt, their timbers inspected and reinforced where necessary. Fences were restored, and the scattered livestock gathered and returned to enclosures, some still coated in frost and ice. The scale of the work underscored both the storm's force and the fragility of structures built without foresight. Henry moved among them, demonstrating the techniques that had preserved his lean-to. He showed how moss and canvas could provide insulation against cutting wind and heavy snow, and how lashings of rawhide could secure beams against shifting weight. Villagers watched closely, noting the placement of supports and the angles of overhangs, occasionally asking brief, practical questions about spacing or material selection. His instructions were methodical, limited to necessary gestures and comments, leaving the work itself to illustrate the principles. Children lingered at a distance, curiosity pulling them close to observe the lean-to and its careful construction. They traced the lines of beams with their eyes, noting how the structure rose from the cliff without fear of collapse. Adults, once doubtful or dismissive, now acknowledged the value of preparation, each pause in their labor allowing them to measure the precision and forethought applied. The lessons were tangible. Careful observation of the environment, deliberate reinforcement, and patient work could withstand even the most relentless winter conditions. By week's end, the settlement bore signs of recovery, and conversations shifted subtly from the storm's devastation to the lessons imparted by Henry's foresight. His lean-to, still perched high and unmarked by the avalanche, remained a visible testament to what could be accomplished through deliberate labor and attentive planning. The valley's winter remained harsh, but the village had gained knowledge, and with it, a new respect for the patient, measured approach that had ensured a young man's survival when the storm passed. Years passed, and the settlement expanded along the valley, its growth shaped quietly by the memory of the winter of 1893. Henry Lawson's lean-to, perched high on the northern cliff, remained intact, a modest structure against the vast mountainside, yet heavy with significance. Settlers new to the area would sometimes pause to examine the shelter, noting the careful joinery, the moss insulation, and the deliberate angles that had allowed it to endure where others had fallen. Its presence served as a silent lesson, a reminder that patience and observation could withstand forces far beyond human control. Henry, now older and measured in his movements, occasionally recounted the events of that winter to those who would listen. He spoke without dramatization, focusing on the principles that had guided his work: attentive observation of the environment, restrained action, and patient, methodical preparation. Children lingered near the cliff's edge, curious about the structure and the boy who had once stood where they now did, while adults nodded quietly, acknowledging the practical wisdom embedded in his choices. The community, once dismissive, now carried these lessons forward, incorporating similar foresight into barns, cabins, and fences across the growing settlement. The lean-to itself remained unchanged, weathered but unbroken, its timbers darkened by years yet holding firm. Winds howled down the cliff as winters came and went, yet the shelter stood as a testament to careful work and foresight. Each snowdrift that passed around it echoed the valley's memory of that decisive season, and every rebuilt roof and fence elsewhere reflected the understanding gained from one young man's diligence. Survival, it was clear, belonged not to those who acted hastily or sought forceful solutions, but to those who measured, observed, and prepared with care. The cliffside shelter remained a quiet, enduring symbol of that principle, its legacy woven into the rhythm of life in the valley. If you enjoyed this story of survival and foresight, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more frontier tales that reveal the quiet power of patience and preparation.